Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
News around public lands these days seems to revolve entirely around the Trump administration. In the case of public employees for environmental responsibility, many of the steps the administration is taking with the operational efficiencies of the National Park Service and other land management agencies certainly are keeping PEER busy. But what exactly is PEER, and what is their mission? This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. For as long as the Traveler has been in existence, going back 20 years, stories recounting PEER and its lawsuits against land management agencies have appeared frequently in our coverage. To explain the nonprofit organization's role, our guest today is Tim Whitehouse, PEER's executive director. We'll be back in a minute with Tim.
Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Hi, Tim. Welcome to the Traveler.
Thank you, Kurt. It's good to be here.
Hey, I appreciate you making time. A little busy at PEER these days, but before we get into that, what exactly is Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility?
So PEER is an organization that works with public employees. We do a number of things. We can represent whistleblowers in the environmental space, and we do that pro bono, meaning without charge. We work with anonymous activists. Those could be employees in the federal government or state or local governments that come to us with information that is concerning, and we believe it should be in the public domain. So we will send FOIAs and we will use other document requests to get these documents in the public domain. We also file lawsuits on behalf of former government employees and at times current government employees to make sure federal agencies are applying the law as they should. And we file investigative reports with inspector generals and with Congress, making sure there's proper oversight of federal government agencies.
Quite a wheelhouse there of work that you have. Never a slow day, is it?
There's never a slow day. It varies tremendously. And, we're often referred to as a watchdog because what we do is try and watch governments carefully to make sure that they're treating their employees well and they're complying with the laws that they're supposed to comply with. And we constantly want them to push for better environmental and public health protections.
You know, the Traveler's been around for 20 years come this August, and I think if we went back and looked through all the past issues of the Traveler, that PEER would be right up there with NPS in number of mentions in our coverage.
Yeah, the public lands issues are very important to our members. I am fairly new to PEER. I've been here since 2019, and I come from a background in the environmental protection area, in the pollutants area, so it's a little different than public lands. And I have to say, I have learned so much by working at Pier and by working with public employees that work for the National Park Service or the Bureau of Land Management or state agencies. And it's been a real journey for me. And understanding Pier's role in helping protect public lands has been a real honor in my life. So I'm glad to be here.
And you guys really do cover all the legal bases. It seems you defend employees who feel they were wrongly terminated. You sue the Park Service for possibly not meeting its responsibility and in terms of environmental studies or whatnot. And of course, now with the Trump administration back for the second time, you have a little work on your hands, don't you?
Yeah, we do. We had predicted this around the election that things would get really bad. But I think things are even worse than we expected. They're even worse than they were laid out in Project 2025. And I think everything that we expected to happen is happening, but in a supercharged way, in a way that's much more destructive than we could have anticipated. And that's across the federal government. We often tell people, reporters that call us or people that call us with concerns and ask, how bad is it? That if you read the newspapers and feel like things are really bad, it's worse than that. And so unfortunately, we, have privy to a lot of the things going on and a lot of the ways public employees are being treated that don't make the headlines. And so it's very discouraging. But I will offer a note of optimism. The vibe seems to be changing. And so we need to make sure in the next 2 or 3 years that we continue to build off of the groundswell of opposition that's forming to some of the more destructive and inappropriate actions this administration's taking against public lands.
I think the president and his close staff learned from the first time they were in office how government works, and I think they really came in to hit the ground running and possibly overwhelm opponents with the flurry of executive orders and changes that are being forced through. I mean, I don't think a lot of people would argue with the need to, from time to time, check on federal government to see if it's operating efficiently and the best bang for the buck, so to speak. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what inspector generals are for. That's what the general accounting office is for. That's what Congress is for, to look for waste, fraud, and abuse in the government. And we certainly do our fair share of that. So there are these arms of government that look at what the agencies are doing to try and identify waste, fraud, and abuse. And they do that very well. Where the system has broken down in the past is usually Congress, or, there's a particular interest group that wants to keep something. And so there was a bit of stasis that fit into all the federal government, and that's quite normal. But having said that, by and large, the federal government is extremely productive. It provides great value for actually very little money. And the National Park Service is an example of that. And so, what the administration undertook was what they call flooding the zone, keep everyone so busy and off guard that we can't focus on any one thing at any one time. And so it's a very effective strategy. I say that, some of the issues we're working on would have been headlines for weeks on end that barely make the news now because there's so much stuff out there, from immigration to tariffs to what's happening at the Environmental Protection Agency to space launches. There is just so much information and so much change happening that it's hard to organize around some of these issues.
Do you think that, the Republican Party has a rare trifecta right now in Washington? They control not only the White House, but both chambers of Congress. And it seems that the Republicans in Congress are pretty complacent with what the president has been doing without conducting any oversight. Is that why you guys have an increased workload, do you think?
Well, I think it's Beyond that, I think it's because of the level of illegality that's occurring. If they were flooding the zone with things that were legal, then the remedies and options would be fewer. But most of what the Trump administration has been doing is not authorized by law, is contrary to congressional appropriations, and is based upon executive orders, which have really no force of law in and of themselves. So we're really busy because of the level of illegality and the pace of change that this administration's doing. In terms of oversights, I grew up, Kurt, probably around the time you did when oversight was a bipartisan word. Sure, the Republicans were generally more conservative than the Democrats, but whether it was a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, Congress and people from both parties would provide oversight. And there's no oversight now. It's 100% get in line or get out. But we are hearing that there are a lot of elected Republican representatives that are making calls behind the scenes because they are concerned about some of the things that are happening. But I think they're still, by and large, afraid to speak publicly and spend any political capital to challenge the president.
It's almost ludicrous because they're afraid, from what I've heard, of being primaried,
Right.
and you think they would be afraid of the voters kicking them out regardless.
Yeah, it's all about the primaries now, and so that's quite unfortunate, and it makes for more extreme government.
Just so listeners don't get the wrong idea, you're a bipartisan organization. You sue who's ever in the administration, and it's not solely restricted for Republicans. And we're going to get into some of the Biden administration stuff that you guys have taken aim at. But certainly, as you mentioned, the President Trump is flooding the zone. One of the issues that you guys have filed a lawsuit over, and I'll be curious to see what you can tell us about that, was his move to eliminate civil service protections for a lot of federal employees. Under the president's plan, thousands of federal employees with civil service protections would be converted to at-will employees, meaning they could be fired without cause. What's the status on that one?
Yeah, so we're attempting to go back to the spoil system. When I say we, the country, the current administration, where you gave your jobs to your friends and colleagues and political supporters. And in the Park Service, I think that would be particularly devastating to think that park superintendents and park maintenance people and, throughout the Park Service, different managerial or policy level positions would be political and fired at will. That's just frightening. I can't imagine what the Park Service would be like if that were to be implemented. So we have sued. The Schedule F, as we call it, regulations are being proposed. And we would expect to see movement on that lawsuit in about a month or two. And we are working with two wonderful organizations, one called Crew and one called Democracy Forward, to try and stop these regulations and make sure the civil service stays a merit-based system. And of course, that there is adequate political oversight. But that's not what this is about. This isn't about political oversight of the civil service. This is about making the civil service complacent to the political whims of the day.
Now, I'm not sure how clear your crystal ball is, but the president, in his budget proposal for fiscal 26, called for $1 billion worth of cuts to the Park Service, 900 million in the operations budget, the day-to-day budget for the parks. He also talked about divesting some units of the national park system. Is that latter idea something you guys might go to court over? Is there any legal grounds that stand in his way from doing that?
Yeah, we'll have to wait to see how that plays out. But certainly, if you're transferring Park Service land to, non-Park Service entities, you have to follow specific laws and regulations. And I know those things have been proposed in the past, and generally, the states in particular, while they may talk about wanting some of the federal lands, don't have the resources to do it. So when push comes to shove, a lot of these ideas don't go anywhere. So it's something we will certainly watch to see how it plays out. In terms of the larger, budget cuts, one thing I've learned in my 6 years at Peer, and particularly in the last, since January working with Peer, is just how understaffed the National Park Service was to begin with. And as someone that uses the national park system, how the some of the degradation in terms of the maintenance is just becoming very visible in some of the parks I've personally visited. And so the idea that there's waste in the National Park Service is just simply not true. So I think something else is going on here in terms of the end game with the National Park Service. And unfortunately, no one is articulating what that is, except for the secretary in sort of broad strokes, but it's not sort of a vision about public lands. It's a vision about making money off of public lands and excluding public input. So I think the budget cuts, while I don't have a crystal ball, a year ago I would have said that's preposterous. It could never happen. It will not happen. But all bets are off the table in terms of what the future of the national park system is under this administration. And they will really work to wreak havoc for the next few years.
There's been talk. John Jarvis, the Park Service director under the Obama administration, and others have said the end game is privatize the national parks. What I don't understand about that is the Park Service is arguably the most beloved federal agency. Record 332 million people went to the parks last year, the national park system. The Park Service budget is 1/15th of 1% of the federal budget. Why tear it down? What's to be gained?
Yeah, Kurt, I grew up in a lower middle class family, in the 1970s. We never stayed in a hotel until I went to college. We never flew an airplane. We would pack our car up and drive from Connecticut to New Hampshire to camp in national parks or national forests. That was a big treat for us. We would drive down to the Shenandoahs to camp and meet friends in the Shenandoah National Park. Or if we were really exotic, we would drive to West Virginia and camp in the national forest there. And I'm saying that because the national parks are primarily, in my opinion, used by working men and women in this country for affordable, beautiful, lovely vacations. They're used by foreign visitors, and it appeals to a different type of person than the people that are running the government right now. I am absolutely certain most of the people running the government have never used the national parks the way you and I and most Americans have. And so they are seeing it through a lens of money.
Another issue that you guys are keeping an eye on, appropriations bills proposed by the House of Representatives. I know you said Pierce said would further gut the ranks of law enforcement rangers in the National Park Service, putting visitors and natural resources at risk. Is that still the case? I know that was a couple months ago. I think back in November we had that story, and things have zoomed forward. And I know the House Speaker Johnson wants to try and get a budget bill out by Memorial Day. Doesn't look like he'll make it. But what are you hearing? Is it still doom and gloom for the Park Service?
I think it will be doom and gloom for a while. I think well, first of all, I want to preface this by saying I would really love to see the National Park Service and the Department of Interior get out ahead of who is actually leaving the government, what positions and where those positions are, and identify really what needs to be filled. Because, you and I and the rest of the American people and people that love parks are sort of in this guessing game trying to piece this mosaic of personnel actions that are happening and trying to figure out what it's going to look like in 2 or 3 months or years, and we don't know. But for law enforcement, it's been an issue that has concerned us greatly for a number of years. We've had a number of park rangers, law enforcement rangers, come to us with pretty harrowing stories and concerns about the impacts of cutbacks in those ranks, both for search and rescue, to keep our parks safe. And so that's been a huge issue that's predated the Trump administration is the decline in law enforcement. And, I've heard figures that for every 17,000 visitors, there's one Park Service employee. And if those ratios are correct, that's a huge strain on the Park Service employees. And we want to make sure the parks are safe. Now, the administration and I think some of the Republicans in Congress have promised to protect or at least reinstate law enforcement and rangers from the rifts that are going on and not making them eligible for all the forks in the road. But nonetheless, the ranks are depleted, and I think a lot of these people will be leaving because the working conditions are so awful.
We're talking about positions in the Park Service and what's going to vanish and whatnot. And Interior Secretary Burgum, gave an order to the acting Park Service director that you will see that visitors have a great time in the national parks. And if you have to reallocate staff from the backcountry or from resource and inventory duties, put them on the front lines. That's got to fill or leave a big void in a large part of the Park Service's role. I mean, the National Park Service Organic Act of 1916 gave the Park Service the primary mandate of ensuring that the resources are preserved for future generations. And under the Secretary's order, it sounds like that's not what he's worried about.
No, this administration is not worried about future generations. It's worried about extracting value from existing resources, and that's really unfortunate. We've heard stories, and I think there's been articles published about people in the Park Service being assigned other duties because the people that have been assigned those duties have left. So you may have a ranger also in charge of cleaning the toilets, or you may have less trail clearing, but someone may need to go out there occasionally to clear something that is causing a public health risk. So there's no planning here. It's just trying to create a facade that things will be normal by keeping the gates and the visitor centers open to the extent possible. And this false facade that everything is okay is the look they are trying to give, but that's going to crack this summer, and it's cracking in some of the parks already.
Well, and you have to wonder what would happen if, God forbid, Yellowstone was flooded like it was a couple of years ago, and you had all those rangers come in off duty to make sure everybody was safe and sound. Or last fall when Helene came up the coast and really hit the Blue Ridge Parkway pretty hard. If you didn't have Park Service personnel on board to deal with those issues, it sounds like they're playing with dynamite. Fingers crossed that nothing bad happens.
Yeah, and then there are the little things that may not make national news, but are really important. Search and rescues, where you may have had 3 or 4 people go out on a very dangerous search and rescue. I know for a fact, confidentially, that in some of these places, there will only be one person available to do that. And there may not even be a dispatcher there to do that. So we don't want to wait for the emergency and for the horror stories to happen. We just want to go back to the point of emphasizing that the National Park Service was understaffed. It was one of the most efficient and effective organizations in the country, government agencies. And what's happening here is not an effort to make things more efficient.
I'm wondering, Tim, I think the RIF plan was supposed to be submitted to the Office of Personnel Management or Management and Budget back on April 13th or 14th. The fact that we haven't heard anything further on details necessarily of the Interior Department's RIF plans, we've heard what people think is going to happen with the focus on Washington and the regional offices and natural resource stewardship areas. Do you think the fact that we haven't heard anything reflects that they are hearing pushback and they are concerned about moving forward with drastic cuts?
Yeah, it would be nice to know if they're transparent about their motivations, but there was also a court order, a temporary restraining order against many federal agencies, including the Department of Interior, from implementing RIF plans because they were articulating RIF plans that were based on an executive order. And you can't do that. There's a specific law that the agencies have to follow. And the unions and a number of groups petitioned the federal court to say these plans will violate federal RIF laws and reduction in force laws. And so there's a temporary restraining order that will last a few weeks and then it'll go through the courts. Many of these cases, if you're keeping track of the hundreds and thousands of cases out there, hats off. But many of these cases that sort of decide the power of the president to ignore congressional appropriations and laws passed by Congress will play out over the next few years and reach the Supreme Court. And this may or may not be one of them. But that being said, the RIFs are arbitrary targets that are set by DOJ-related people. And I certainly hope that the secretary behind the scenes is starting to realize that he has to manage his agency. He can't delegate it to others because there will be political consequences for him when this whole thing falls apart, and it will.
Yeah. You know, what was interesting to me, the most recent court order that put a halt on things for 2 weeks, the parties that brought that lawsuit seeking the temporary restraining order pointed out that there's a federal law that dictates how a government reorganization should be followed. And the Trump administration has totally failed to do that. As I recall, the law requires the administration to present both houses of Congress with the plan, with how much money would be saved, and it would take congressional approval to move forward with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I tell people, Bill Clinton downsized the federal government, and he did it appropriately according to the laws of Congress. He did it working with Congress, and he followed the laws of appropriations. So it's been done. Our federal workforce has not grown as a percentage of our population since World War II. So it's already a lean sort of federal government, it's a lean entity. And as we've said before, there's certainly waste, fraud, and abuse, but that's not what this is about.
No, it's not. It would be nice if it was a more strategic approach. See what that would find out. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you guys just aren't anti-Republican. You're anti-abuse and wrongdoing and whatnot. I don't know how much you can talk about this. Valles Caldera National Preserve, former Park Service Director Chuck Sams, in a highly unusual move, at least unusual from what I've seen in my 20 years, approved a permit for the Pueblo down at the MS Pueblo to kill an eagle for ceremonial purposes. And what I've heard is that it might have been more than one eagle and some other species that they were not permitted to take. I know you've sued over Chuck Sam's decision to allow that. Is that case moot? Because he's
Well,
not.
it's moot. We sued to get documents in that case. So, anything that involves the taking of the National Park Service has laws that govern how it's run, and PEER looks to make sure those laws are followed. And in this particular instance, it looks like they were not followed. And these are very sensitive issues. We want to be sensitive to the needs on the ground. But these, permits were rushed through in a non-transparent way. And we want to make sure that the national parks system operates in a transparent manner, allows for public comment and input, and takes in the concerns of all parties. And so in many instances, that doesn't happen. And when we feel it's not happening, we often send FOIAs. We might do a lawsuit or take other actions to make sure the laws are followed. And not all laws are good, but if they're not good, they should be changed.
Right. And I'm presuming that you guys have a lot more success with your FOIAs than we have with ours, just because you're peer. Another lawsuit that you guys brought against the Biden administration had to deal with the old Spanish National Historic Trail. I believe the lawsuit revolved around Interior Department's failure to develop a comprehensive management plan to preserve and protect the trail. That's a many thousand-mile long trail, or many hundreds of mile long trail. What was the issue where the Park Service was not preserving and protecting?
Yes, so the Congress designated the Old Spanish National Historic Trail by statute in 2002. And so the trail spans 2,700 miles and crosses from Santa Fe through different states over to near Los Angeles. And BLM and the National Park Service, they failed to submit a comprehensive plan for managing the trail as required by law. And so we are suing to make sure they develop that plan to protect the trail to the extent required by law. We've identified at least 38 separate projects on federal lands or under federal control that have detrimental impacts on this trail. And so in some areas, the trail's been obliterated. So what we're asking these two agencies to do, and we have to go to court, unfortunately, is to develop a plan to protect the trail as the law requires.
Wow, I wasn't aware that so many projects were impeding the trail, impacting the trail. Any idea why? Was it a lack of personnel, a lack of interest?
I don't know the motivations, and I don't want to ascribe motivations because I know, both BLM and the National Park Service are very busy. I know there's a lot of different political push and pulls on any one particular project, but we saw enough to feel that the integrity of the trail and our public lands were being chipped away by all these separate projects. And it was time to try and put an end to it and develop a plan. And so whether it was just one of those things that fell by the wayside because there were other priorities, whether there was too much political capital to expend on developing a management plan, I really don't know.
And where do things stand now?
So we filed our lawsuit. I think they have a motion to dismiss, and we will end up in court to decide whether a management plan needs to be developed.
Interesting. As we mentioned, there are no shortage of issues for you guys to get involved with. Going back a few years, some issues that one of them is really old, air tour management plans. I don't know if that one's been put to bed yet or not.
Pretty much put to bed. It's being put to bed. So there's a law that required the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration to develop air tour management plans over national parks. And that is to make sure they're at levels that are safe, that they don't disturb the wildlife, and they don't impede upon the visitor experience. And so we first got involved in that because people working at Glacier National Park and nearby communities were concerned about the noise and the impacts of these air tours on wildlife and the visitor experience. And we found this law that had never been implemented. There was never an air tour management plan. So we sued, and the federal courts ordered the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration to develop air tour management plans for all the national parks where there were these commercial air tours. And so there have been a number of specific lawsuits in our overall lawsuit. And I think we are finally wrapping that up and have had some really good results. Glacier National Park is going to phase out these commercial air tours by 2029. Some of the parks in North Dakota are ending air tours. In Hawaii, where air tours were a real problem, those will be scaled back significantly. And the public's had a voice, and there's been some level of environmental impact assessments on these air tours. And the National Park Service and FAA is starting to apply the law after now maybe 25 years.
I guess what I don't understand is that Glacier, in agreeing to phase out air tours, came out and said that they're inappropriate in our national park setting, that they intrude on the visitor experience, that they intrude on wildlife. And then you have other parks like Bryce Canyon National Park, and I think they didn't even look at the impact on wildlife. And you've got so many different approaches to this, whether it's complete phase out, whether it's we're not going to phase out, to well, we'll reduce the number of air tours. Why wouldn't a Park Service director agree with the approach that Glacier took and just order all the parks to phase them out?
Yeah, great question, Kurt. If you can answer that for us, I'd love to. I'd love to know. Um, certainly my preference as a visitor to national parks would be not to have air tours intruding upon the experience. I do believe that parks serve a different purpose, particularly national parks and national wilderness areas. And as a personal matter, would prefer to not see these types of air tours. I've been in other countries where there are air tours hovering over you constantly when you're in a remote, wild area. So we are fortunate that we have been able to scale them back. And the politics of each particular park and location, I imagine those politics are quite intense.
I would think so. I would think so because I believe once upon a time, Grand Canyon National Park had a plan to really cut back on air tours, and I think the late Senator John McCain got in the way of that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely powerful commercial interests involved.
Well, Tim, I can't let you go just yet. I've got one other thorny issue. Curious where it stands. E-bikes in national parks. Where do things stand with e-bikes?
Yeah, so for your listeners, Peer sued on the e-bike issue in the first Trump administration. And we sued because the Trump administration told the parks to treat e-bikes as regular human-powered bicycles. And bicycles in the national park service regulations were human-powered, and e-bikes, as you know, can go up to 60 miles an hour, can go in the backcountry, et cetera, et cetera. And so we sued to make sure that they didn't adopt this definition, which was completely incorrect. And we prevailed. And so the Park Service was supposed to do each park their own plans, accounting for environmental impacts. And so I think each park is developing their own or has developed their own particular plans. This is going to be a generational challenge about how to deal with these new mechanized mobile devices. I run on the C&O Canal or walk on the C&O Canal, which is a park from Washington, D.C. to Pittsburgh almost every day. We live right near it. And we do see more and more of these bikes going, many people obeying the traffic, the speed limits, which are, I think, 20 miles an hour, but many going 40 or 50. And I actually don't know what the C&O Canal rules are, but I know there's no one to enforce them out there.
Why is that?
It's a 186-mile long trail and with very few access points and probably a limited number of rangers. So
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So I think I hit all the name brand cases that you guys are working on. Is there any other case that I haven't touched on that you think people should be aware of?
Well, I think moving forward, I think people need to be aware that we are a resource for whistleblowers in the public service and the park service. We are also heavily involved in many of the personnel actions that are occurring because of efforts to downsize. And many of those people are from the Park Service. And so we are attempting to make sure everyone that comes to us with a legitimate issue and needs legal representation has it, whether it's through peer or through a referral system we have. So we've referred many people on to law firms that are taking things pro bono. And so we are doing our best, to make sure public employees have adequate representation because they are really suffering right now and they are really the backbone of the National Park Service.
That's Tim Whitehouse. He's the Executive Director of Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. Tim, thanks so much for joining us. You certainly have a hefty workload there, and hopefully it will thin out before too long, but I fear it won't.
Yes, thank you, Kurt, for having me. Take care.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. As Pierre's lawsuits move forward, we'll work at The Traveler to keep you informed on the outcomes. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.